I told you guys yesterday, we lectured that Germany invaded the Maginot Line. They overran France, took over control of northern France. They even set up a German-controlled government at Vichy. And so the French are in pretty bad shape. The point being is that the British now are sitting back wondering exactly when they're going to be attacked. And the British morale was not that great at the time until May 10th of 1940 when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. And we told you yesterday that he had a rare gift for leadership, and his job was to rally the British. We made a scenario like the volleyball team's down 2-0 to a really, really good team, and your attitude at that time is, boy, there's no way we can come back and win 3 straight, and all of a sudden your coach inspires you to motivate you to come back and win those 3 games. That's what Winston Churchill had to do. And so his leadership and confidence really strengthened the hopes of the British. He told the British citizens, we will never surrender to Germany. And by June of 1940, Prime Minister Churchill was preparing his country for what he knows is going to be the Battle of Britain. Okay, that's where we ended yesterday. Well, in August of 1940, Adolf Hitler unleashed an all-out air attack of Great Britain known as Operation Sea Lion. Okay, in August of 1940, Adolf Hitler unleashed an all-out air attack of Great Britain known as Operation Sea Lion. Now, I mentioned it was an air attack because what Hitler's philosophy was is we will take our Air Force, we will knock out the Royal Navy from the English Channel, we will destroy the Royal Air Force from the skies above England, and then we will march ground troops into England and take it over. That was his idea. So, as I mentioned just a second ago, Hitler, excuse me, in August of 1940 unleashes this massive air attack against Great Britain, and it's known as Operation Sea Lion. And his goal is to attack Great Britain in an all-out effort to sweep the Royal Navy from the English Channel and the Royal Air Force from the skies above Great Britain, clearing the way for ground march and taking over of that country. Well, what Hitler didn't expect was the tremendous effort that the Royal Navy and the British Air Force gave for Winston Churchill. He coached up that volleyball team to come back from 2-0 down and sweep the final 3. And because of the resistance that the British put up against Hitler's Air Force, Hitler chose to postpone his invasion of Britain until the next spring. So again, Winston Churchill rallied the British Navy, he rallied the British Air Force, and the resistance that Hitler got from these 2 entities, which he did not expect, surprised him, as I mentioned, and forced him to postpone his planned invasion of Great Britain until the next spring. We'll see if that happens. Okay, we'll see if that happens. Now, I often say, what happens if the British Navy and the British Air Force lose and Great Britain is taken over by Germany? I mean, you can't even rewrite that history. What the United States got into this conflict, what would they have done? You know, it would have been a whole different ballgame. So Winston Churchill's contribution to keeping Britain free of German rule at this point in the Battle of Britain was huge. Okay? All right, we'll move towards America a little bit. We'll talk about American defense measures. What is the United States of America doing during this time they are witnessing these events in Europe? Well, obviously, because of the conflict in Europe, the United States begins to take steps to strengthen its own defenses, because they don't know whether they're going to get involved in that war in Europe, or according to what Hitler's doing, who knows, he might invade the United States. He doesn't turn out to be the one to invade the United States. The Japanese do. But America's thinking, we better be prepared. So after hearing about these events in Europe, the United States begins to take steps to strengthen its own defense. Now, when have we had a draft in this country? During wartime, right? Well, this is so serious that Congress is debating the possibility of having the first peacetime military draft in history, where they would draft soldiers into the army, etc., prior to being involved in a war, so they'd be prepared. That would be very unusual to do that. We've never had a draft during peacetime. Okay? Well, they decide not to do that, but they do something else instead. And that instead happens on September 16, 1940. So as Congress is debating the possibility of having the first peacetime draft in American history, they decide to do something different. And on September 16th of 1940, Congress passes the Burke Wodsworth Act. So rather than have a peacetime draft on September 16th of 1940, Congress passes the Burke Wodsworth Act, and President Roosevelt signs that bill into law, which means he supported it. Okay? So rather than a peacetime draft, on September 16th, 1940, President Roosevelt signs into law the Burke Wodsworth Act. Now what the Burke Wodsworth Act does is it requires that all men between the age of 21 and 35 do two things. Okay? The Burke Wodsworth Act requires that all men between the age of 21 and 35 do two things. Anybody want to guess what they might be that they had to do? Now they're not going to draft them. They're doing this instead. But to be drafted eventually you'd have to do what? What do you have? Well, yeah, at 18 you're going to have to sign up. What do you call that? You register for the Selective Service. That's by law even now when you're 18. So the first part of the Burke Wodsworth Act is then to register for the draft. That way they'd already have the names when they start pulling the ping pong balls out. Remember we talked about that? When they have a draft, what they do is they have 365 ping pong balls in this thing. They pull out the first one, and it's August 28th. And everybody with the birthday August 28th has a number 1 draft number. Then they draw another one, whatever that day is, as number 2. And then when they draft, they say, well, we're going to take the first 10 draft numbers, and they're coming in. That's how the draft works. Well, rather than draft anyone in peacetime, the first thing the Burke Wodsworth Act did is it required that all men between the ages of 21 and 35 register for the draft. The second part of that was pretty interesting, because every man between the age of 21 and 35 had to take part in 1 year of military training. Even though they weren't officially in the armed services, they had to submit to 1 year of military training. Why would they do that? So they're ready if they do have a draft. They don't have to prepare them. That actually is a pretty good idea. So they didn't have a draft. They made you register for the draft, and then they made you go through a year of training. So if they did have to have a draft, if we got involved in this deal, they'd be ready, trained, and ready to go. Okay? Remember World War I? John Pershing wouldn't send troops over there right away, and it frustrated the Allies because he didn't have them properly trained. Well, they're learning, aren't they? Okay? Well, just because we weren't sending troops over to Great Britain and the Allies didn't mean we weren't sending military aid and supplies. So we started doing that. And the Allies, including Great Britain, paid us for those supplies for a while. So even though we weren't sending troops over, we were certainly sending military supplies and aid. And the idea was that those Allies, including Great Britain, would pay us for those. Well, got to the point where they couldn't do so. So we just decided to cut them off and not send them any more supplies? No. We decided that we would do something different than that. So President Roosevelt convinced Congress to pass a law known as the Lend-Lease Act to help out those Allied countries when they couldn't pay us for our supplies and aid. So to solve the issue of non-payment, President Roosevelt convinced Congress to pass what was known as the Lend-Lease Act. It's pretty simple. What does that mean, McKinsey? What do you think happened as a result of the Lend-Lease Act? Right, exactly right. We would lend not only Great Britain, but we would send military supplies and aids to the Allies, and then when the war ended, they would pay us back more than likely with interest. Okay? So rather than cut them off and have them succumb to German authority, even though they couldn't pay us, we signed the Lend-Lease Act, which stated that we, the Allies, including Great Britain, we would lend or lease them materials they needed for the war, and the money for these required materials would be paid back to the United States after the war ended. Give you an idea of just how serious we were. After that act was passed in March of 1941, we spent $7 billion making ships, planes, tanks, and other supplies that were sent overseas to the Allies. So when that bill was passed in March of 1941, the United States spent over $7 billion for ships, planes, tanks, and other supplies that we sent to the Allies so they could compete against the Axis powers in the European theater of World War II. Now, even though we're trying to stay out of this, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of why we could not. And the first example of what's going to push us towards war happened in October of 1941. October. I think the date you remember is December 7th, right? But this happened in October of 1941. And in October of 1941, a German submarine torpedoed an American destroyer called the USS Reuben James. And it sank. And it made a lot of people in America upset. So in October of 1941, a German submarine torpedoed and sank an American destroyer called the USS Reuben James. And obviously that was a bad thing. German torpedo sinking an American battleship. And so what do you think a lot of Americans thought we ought to do after that happened? We ought to go to war with Germany. Well, a lot of Americans weren't in favor of us going to war either, because they knew what the end result might be. So President Roosevelt simply made the decision, and he did not think the sinking of the USS Reuben James was enough of an act for us to declare war on Germany. But it was pushing us closer, wasn't it? Okay? Well, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which are the events really that are going to lead to Pearl Harbor, and that's rising threat from Japan. So let's forget Germany and let's forget Europe. Now we got to worry about the Japanese on the other side of us and some actions they're taking. So rising threat from Japan. Now, as I mentioned to you, Japan was just as greedy for land as Hitler and Mussolini. Okay? They wanted all the land in the Far East, the Pacific, etc. And they started this quest for land in July of 1941 when they invaded and occupied French Indonesia. So Japan begins its assault on land, so to speak, in the Pacific in July of 1941 when they attack and occupy French Indochina. Obviously, that is not a Japanese possession because it's called French Indochina. Well, any time a dictator or a dictator-led country starts taking over democracies, it brings up concern in the United States. And Franklin Roosevelt was both surprised and alarmed that the Japanese would have the gall to invade and occupy French Indochina, a democracy. So in retaliation for the Japanese actions, Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. So in retaliation for their attack and occupying French Indochina, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States. What does that mean, Nick, if your assets are frozen? We're going to get to that, but specifically if I freeze your assets in your DC trip, if I freeze those, what does that mean? You're not going to be able to go where? To DC because your assets are frozen. I'm not going to take your money you've earned and put it towards your trip, so you're not going to go. So any monies that we owe Japan for things they shipped us, we froze those assets and we would not pay them for those. Okay, so we froze their assets. Well, that wasn't all President Roosevelt did, because he was very upset at their actions. He also placed an embargo on important items that we exported to Japan that they really needed. And an embargo basically is a ban on trade. So he put an embargo on certain things that he knew the Japanese really needed from us because they didn't produce much of it themselves. And those things that I'm talking about that he put an embargo on were gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, and steel. So not only did he freeze Japanese assets in the United States, he also placed an embargo or a ban on trade and would not ship any gasoline, machine tools, scrap iron, or steel to Japan. So how did Japan retaliate for that action? They froze American assets in Japan. They froze American assets in Japan. So basically, what's trade happened, McKenna, between Japan and the United States? What's happened with the trade between the two countries? Ended. Yeah, it's basically not happening, okay? Well, this was interesting timing, because I told you that Japan yesterday, at that time in history, did not have a dictator, right? The military did. Well, just so happened in 1941, Japanese General Hideki Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan. So now they have a single dictator, don't they? A military dictator, because he's a general. So in 1941, Hideki Tojo, lead general of the Japanese military, becomes Prime Minister of Japan. So now one man is speaking on behalf of all the people, right? Now, this is going to lead us up to what we know as Pearl Harbor. Because on November 20th of 1941, with Tojo in command, making all the decisions, Japan makes 3 insulting demands upon the United States. Japan makes 3 insulting demands upon the United States. You don't demand things, you negotiate, right? You have conciliation, where you get together. And if you don't get together the first time when you're doing conciliation, you have reconciliation, right? You talk, you don't make demands. Well, here are the 3 demands that the government, basically Tojo, made upon the United States on November 20th, 1941. He said, number 1, you must unfreeze all Japanese assets in the United States. Okay? The United States must unfreeze all Japanese assets. The United States must unfreeze all Japanese assets. The second insulting demand that Tojo made upon the United States is he said that the United States must supply Japan with as much gasoline as they wanted. You must supply Japan with as much gasoline as they wanted. And the third one maybe might have been the most insulting, is that we had very good relationships with China at the time, and we used to send aid to China. And the third demand was that the United States must seize all aid to China. The United States must seize all aid to China. Well, the United States has 2 choices at this point. 3 choices, actually. They can either agree to the demands, or they can not agree to the demands, reject them, or they could reject them and come up with some alternatives, right? Well, that's what the United States tried to do. They rejected the 3 demands, but they tried to, negotiate a compromise. And the Japanese would have no part of it. Okay? So the United States refused to meet the 3 demands, but they did offer some counter proposals, trying to negotiate, some common ground, and the Japanese would have no part of it at all. Okay? And on December 7th, ironically, of 1941, the Japanese government announced that they would no longer negotiate ever again with the United States of America. That the United States of America was too unreasonable. They didn't want to have any conciliation or reconcile. They just wanted to be demanding, which wasn't true. But on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese announced to the world that they would no longer negotiate with the United States of America. All right, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which you should have some familiarity with, and that is the attack on Pearl Harbor and war declared by the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor and war declared by the United States. Well, as you are well aware of, I'm sure, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese airplanes attacked the United States Navy fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Now, I want you to think about what we've been talking about. Does that seem kind of weird to you, that date? Because it was just the same date that they said they were no longer going to negotiate. So you think from the time they said they were no longer going to negotiate till they attacked, that's when they planned this whole thing? You know this thing was planned way in advance. And they were just waiting for an excuse to use it. Why do you think they gave us those 3 insulting demands? Because they knew we would turn them down and would open a door for them to attack the United States, which they did. Now, the United States was taken completely by surprise, and the attack produced some serious losses for the United States. I'm going to give you some statistics on that.